This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 302, entitled, I'm having some technical problems, so I can't connect to the internet on my main computer, so I'll read out the description on my older computer, which is smaller, much smaller, and lower down, so my eyes will be directed downwards. Entitled, "Millions of Western women will go through a lot of pain as they fail to adapt to men's growing masculist anger at women, so are then rejected by men." Description. This flyer claims that in the coming decade or so, millions of Western women will go through a lot of pain as they fail to adapt to the rise of masculist anger at women by men, and will be rejected by such men. We will see the equivalent of what happened in the 70s, when millions of Western women divorced their traditional husbands who could not adapt to the growing feminist consciousness of their wives. Okay, so now to the big screen. Millions of Western women will go through a lot of pain as they fail to adapt to men's growing masculist anger at women, so are then rejected by men. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. I've been back in Australia for nearly 3 months now, which has been time enough for me to gain some first-hand experience at the that's electronic, dating game, trying to find a part-time female companion to have a bit of social life with, so as not to be totally alone, besides my immediate family. Since my large website is easily viewed by any woman who approaches me via the dating company we belong to, there's no point in me trying to hide my masculist views, because if I bother to put time and mental energy into a woman, and she later discovers my masculist opinions and is abhorred by them and cuts contact with me, then I've wasted that time and energy. It's more efficient to be upfront with these women, that is, give them what I'm starting to call the masculist test. That is, asking them from the very beginning to look at my masculist videos on my website to see if they can tolerate the masculist ideas in these videos. Anyone who has some experience with dating sites knows that such dating is a numbers game. That is, you just have to plough through dozens, if not hundreds, of potential companions before hitting on one that is halfway reasonable. That has certainly been my recent experience. When I was living in China for the past few years, I was effectively living in a cultural cocoon, cut off from contact with women of my own culture. Since I had such a low opinion of the Chinese, with their mean-spirited and authoritarian personalities, I did not bother to get fluent in the Chinese language. I was actually afraid to get fluent, because if I'd bothered, I would have been too tempted to let fly with my hatred of the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, which has killed 80 million of its own citizens under Mao. Yet his face is still on the money, making the CCP the greatest tyrannical regime in history, and hence risk being thrown out of the country. But, having quit the Chinese shithole, I'm now back in a first world, democratic, rich country, namely Australia, where I grew up, and can benefit from Oz's generous pension policy. So now I'm in a position to start e-dating, and that is what I'm now doing and will report on in this flyer. The bottom line, I'm finding, is that women, about 95% of them, find my masculist ideas abhorrent and quickly reject me. Only a few of them bother to answer back, saying in effect, F you. This is almost a universal rejection, but not quite, since that still leaves the other 5%, and with 100 women, that still leaves a few, hence the need to see e-dating as a numbers game. So I found a female companion who is reasonably compatible and for whom feminism has not played much of a role in her life, so has not been as indoctrinated as monocultured Australian females. My impression is that these Oz women are being confronted for the first time in their lives with an angry masculist who breaks the taboo on men criticising and ideologically attacking women. Most men are nice to women for the simple reason that they want to fuck these women. Since women have a monopoly on access to their vaginas, it is the woman who decides which man gets inside her. Obviously, no man is going to get inside her whom she considers to be a misogynist, as angry masculists are to most categories of women, although not to all. It therefore comes as a real shock for these women to be confronted with an angry masculist who uses his male level of verbal aggression and his male intelligence to attack the negative features of women. My impression is that these women have so deeply accustomed themselves to men behaving nicely towards them that they expect it unconsciously and feel deeply threatened and strongly offended when confronted by an angry masculist attack, as are viewable on my videos. This near total rejection experience got me thinking. It got me wondering how these women will react in the future when they get the same kind of reaction as they are now getting from me, from nearly all the intellectual men they come across or try to date? I'm predicting that the world will see a repeat of what happened in the 70s, when millions of Western women divorced their traditional husbands who failed to adapt to the rising feminist consciousness of their wives, resulting in an unbridgeable gap in attitudes and gender role expectations within the couple until the marriage bond broke, resulting in a lot of pain on the part of the ex-husbands as they were left stranded by their ex-wives who could no longer tolerate their ex-husband's traditional gender role expectations towards them. I anticipate something similar happening in the next decade or so, as millions of Western women fail to adapt to the growing masculinist anger of millions of Western men against women, resulting in millions of Western women being rejected by these masculisted men, who put new moral and existential pressures on women and reject those women who show themselves incapable of adapting to the new masculinist consciousness of their men. The level of bitterness felt by these rejected women will only be made more painful due to their feminist attitude that men are the problem. The anti-masculinist attitudes of these non-adapting women will only antagonize the masculinist men more, making it more likely that these masculinist men will reject these women. More specifically, the typical monoconscious attitudes of most women, in brackets, that is, they've had their feminist consciousness raised, that is, they've been taught that men oppress women, but know nothing about masculism, hence are not conscious of how women oppress men, for example, through female financial parasitism, female manslavery, fluffy feminist hypocrisy in the divorce courts, financially massacring one father in 4, fluffy implacable resistance against legislation of the paternity rejection right, etc., close bracket, will cause these women to be much more intolerant towards masculists because they have been taught by feminism that men are the oppressors. So when they hear masculists haranguing women for the way that masculists say that women oppress men, then these women interpret these masculist critiques as more proof that men are the problem because they are complaining against women, criticizing women, which is something that feminism utterly rejects. This feminist rejection of masculist criticism only enrages the masculists all the more, hence the use of the term feminazi by the masculists. A vicious circle is thus set up between feminist-influenced women and the masculists, resulting in real contempt on both sides, as shown by the organised opposition of feminazis at masculist/MGTOW organised meetings. For example, just a few months ago in my city of Melbourne, Australia, a bunch of feminazis yelled abuse at men who were complaining about being financially massacred in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce courts. The insensitivity and callousness of these feminazis towards these men who had had their kids ripped away from them, who were financially massacred by feminazi divorce court judges and lawyers, only increased the level of hatred of these men for these feminazi sadists who had no understanding of masculist/MGTOW ideas at all. The fact that 95% of the women who contact me in my e-dating site are repelled by masculist ideas tells me that women are going to suffer hugely in the coming decade or so as they are rejected from all sides by men in a culture that is becoming more masculist/MGTOW by the month, with now 2/3 of young men refusing to marry, refusing to have kids, and spending their money on themselves. With this MGTOW rejection of paternity, and hence longer term, the wiping out of whole populations, it's only a question of time before the journalists latch onto this paternity rejection and spell out its consequences to the general public, giving a splattering of masculist ideas as well. In time, women will become a lot more familiar with masculist ideas and will be repelled by them, as are the few dozen women who have met for the first time in their lives these masculist ideas from me. When millions of women in the Western countries are confronted by masculist ideas coming from millions of men, there will be a change in the gender ecology. For example, imagine that in country A, 99% of women are feminists and know nothing of masculism. Then the occasional isolated masculist will have a hard time finding a woman companion who will tolerate his masculist views. Now imagine a country B, where 99% of the men are masculists. Then the women will be forced to adapt to that reality and will not have the luxury to reject masculist men as repulsive, because if they do, they will not get a man, since in country B, 99% of men are masculists. So, since masculism and MGTOW are fairly new, most women know nothing about these two social movements, so are shocked when they're confronted by angry masculists who attack them for their traditional female expectations towards men, saying these expectations are oppressive to men and are rejected by masculists, etc. As the proportion of men who are influenced by masculist ideas keeps rising, sooner or later there'll be a tipping point where women wake up that they're not going to get a man unless they learn to adapt to the growing proportion of men who put masculist expectations on women and reject these women if they do not adapt to masculist ideas. In the transition period, it's likely, I think, that in the Western countries, millions of women are going to suffer a lot of pain as millions of men reject them for not adapting to the new masculist consciousness of their men. During this transition time, things will be exacerbated by the growing presence of the sex bots and the art wombs, in brackets, sex robots in artificial wombs, so that women lose these two traditional monopolies they've always had. Masculists and MGTOWs will no longer be forced to be nice to women in order to be able to fuck them. Masculists and MGTOWs will be able to fuck their bots and grow their own kids, so that those women who reject masculist ideas will be botted, that is, dumped, replaced by a sex bot, which will have much more attractive curves, prettier faces, creamier, grippier vaginas than real women, 2/3 of whom are either fat or obese and hence unfuckable anyway. Masculists will get very angry at the hypocrisy of monoconscious feminazis, lashing out at it. That is, these feminazis give themselves the right to lash out at men for the ways that men oppress women, but reject the same right for men, for masculists to lash out at women for the ways women oppress men, for example, in such ways as listed earlier. Feminazi monoconscious hypocrisy only increases the level of contempt on the part of the masculists for these feminazi vermin who are destroying the lives of a quarter of fathers in the divorce courts that the fluffy feminists have taken over and used to destroy men, thus indirectly wiping out whole populations, since it is the fluffy feminist hypocrites who are the root cause of the paternity rejection on the part of the masculists and MGTOWs. Monoconscious ignorance on the part of the feminists will cause masculists to be all the angrier at them, which will make the feminazis in turn more hostile towards the masculists and MGTOWs. One can expect the number of confrontations to increase until there are more masculists around for the tipping point in the gender ecology to be reached. When women wake up in their millions that if they don't adapt to the new masculist consciousness, then they're not going to get a man, they are not going to get any sex, and especially they are not going to have a baby. Since the smarter men, that is those men with high IQs, are the first to go masculist, the smart women who aim to reproduce with these quality men will be the first to be hit by the masculist pressure on them. The gender battle will be fought by the smartest men and women. Once that dust settles, the lower classes will follow, which is always the case. The social revolutions are usually begun by a handful of thinkers, sages, intellectuals. Then the journalists take up the new ideas and spread them to the public. Then the trendy upper middle class types pick up the ideas in the magazines and the media, who in turn influence the more mindless masses, the peakers, who